Premier League champions and Champions League quarter-finalists topped off what had been an unfathomable rise from the depths of the EFL for Leicester City. However, not even a decade later, the Foxes find themselves returning to the second division of English football for the second time in 3 years, except this time they do so with no reasonable expectation that they'll bounce straight back. Currently languishing in mid-table in the Championship, albeit faring better than fellow relegated club Southampton, which in itself feels like quite a low bar. The Foxes are staring down the barrel of a PSR-shaped gun, which is something they've grown accustomed to over the last few years, having narrowly escaped a points deduction already due to an accountancy loophole. But I suppose it brings us to our first port of call, the ownership structure. Now, there are plenty of worse owners in football, ranging from greedy and useless to seemingly self-sabotaging. The most egregious example of this being the situation at Sheffield Wednesday involving their owner Dafon Chansiri, who ran that club into the ground. And unfortunately, this was not an isolated incident. Take Yeovil Town, for instance. Their previous owner, Martin Hellier, was so vain in both Oxford Dictionary definitions of the word and termini online that he would issue banning orders to fans that criticised him on social media. And then we have the headline, the main event man himself. Not that one. Sir Jim Ratcliffe, whose Ineos group clearly didn't learn from their mistakes at Nice in Ligue 1, or their mistakes at Lausanne Sport in the Swiss Super League. I'm getting sidetracked, but my point is, well-meaning, business-savvy and successful owners have become a dying breed in modern football, and at least King Power appear to have the club's best interests at heart. Plus, truthfully, it could be argued that some of Leicester's financial decline was due to circumstances beyond their control. King Power International Group is a Thai duty-free and travel retail consortium based in the capital of Thailand, Bangkok, and whose operations took 2 substantial hits in the last few years of the 2010s. On the 27th of October 2018, the then owner and chairman of King Power and Leicester City, Vichai Srivadhanaprabha, was killed in a freak helicopter accident along with both the pilot and his girlfriend, who was also a pilot, and 2 further members of KP staff. As a result, Vichai's son, Iowa Srivadhanaprabha, would become chairman of both King Power and Leicester City, as well as the Belgian football team Oud Hervelle Leuven, which the King Power Group had acquired in May of 2017. Iowa, often known as Kun Top, was 34 years old at the time of this inheritance, and had won silver at the 2017 Southeast Asian Games as a member of the Thailand polo team, alongside his older brother Apichet. I guess it's important to note that polo isn't exactly the most accessible of sports, but hey-ho, a medal's a medal, who am I to judge? Anyway, the majority of King Power's revenue comes from its government-granted monopoly over Thailand's duty-free retail sector. This includes a 3-storey, 130,000 square foot flagship store located in the heart of Bangkok's business district, as well as branches at 6 of Thailand's 10 international airports. The critical element amongst all of this is their dependency on footfall. At the end of March 2020, almost 2 months after COVID-19 was declared an international public health emergency by the Director General of the World Health Organization, Thailand's air and land borders were closed, along with many public entertainment facilities. By April, all education facilities were closed, although rather surprisingly, this would not last for as long as you might expect. These lockdown restrictions had mostly been lifted by July of the same year, with the notable exception being the closing of its borders. It wasn't until the 1st of November 2021, approximately 18 months later, that Thailand relaxed those restrictions, allowing fully vaccinated tourists to visit once more. However, the damage had already been done. The seeds were sown and the cracks began to form. For the directly affected years of 2020 and 2021, revenue would plummet to 8.1 billion and then even further to 1.6 billion Thai baht respectively. This amounts to a combined net loss for the King Power Group of 4.64 billion Thai baht over that 2-year period alone. Even with a brief reprieve in 2022, recording 3.75 billion in net profit, the struggles would return in 2023, where another net loss of 651 million would be inflicted on the company. Furthermore, despite extraordinary treatment from the AOT, Airports of Thailand, who would waive King Power's minimum guarantee payments from March 2020 until March 2022, the continued losses compounded to debts in the region of 4 billion Thai baht related to outstanding AOT concession fees alone by 2025. So we have established that the King Power Group were under pressure financially, but what about the club itself? Well, in the 2019-20 season, Leicester City suffered a record pre-tax loss of 67 million Great British pounds sterling. Not only was this reportedly upwards of 3x the previous 12 months deficit, but further analysis indicates that only 13 million of this is a direct consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. This wasn't necessarily of immediate concern, considering how the following season's accounts, one that was almost entirely contested behind closed doors, stated a slightly less worrying 33 million in losses. Meanwhile, on the field, the Foxes would triumph in the FA Cup for the first time, while their recently bought newly professional women's team achieved promotion to the Women's Super League. This would unfortunately be where the club's successes began to wane. Off the back of consecutive fifth-place finishes in the Premier League throughout the pandemic era, the club would regress to 8th, although a semi-final appearance in the Conference League brought some positivity for fans. In March 2023, Leicester would find itself in a shock relegation battle while simultaneously announcing losses for the previous season that were undeniably grim. £92.5 million to be exact. It was an entirely unprecedented fall from grace, which culminated in an 18th place finish and a subsequent relegation from the Premier League. If you thought this was rock bottom, then I'm afraid I've got some bad news. First off, Leicester's losses flat relegation season? £89.7 million. Therefore, with figures like that, I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. Everyone's favourite, profit and sustainability rules. Commonly referred to as PSR, these rules state that clubs with Premier League status are permitted to lose a maximum of £105 million over any given 3-year period. So with these figures I've provided, it seems pretty cut and dry, right? Wrong. Although, you can feel free to blame me for not elaborating fully. You see, these recorded losses do not include, or more accurately deduct, money that is invested into add-backs. An add-back is the term used by the PL and EFL to refer to expenses recognised to be in the general interest of the club and football. This includes women's football, youth development, community projects, and importantly, building infrastructure. This is how Everton were able to spend £800 million, according to The Athletic, on their new Hill Dickinson Stadium, without certainly condemning themselves to numerous PSR breaches. Instead, contrary to popular belief, Everton's 2 recent points deductions, 10 points in February 2024 that was reduced to 6 upon appeal, and then another 2 points in April of the same year, were unrelated to the development of its stadium at Bramley Moor Dock. Therefore, since unveiling a modern state-of-the-art training centre in 2020, which I'll cover in more detail later, King Power set their sights on an even more ambitious project. Dubbed the Masterplan, this proposal included an expansion of the existing East Stand, increasing the total stadium capacity to north of 40,000 seats, as well as a standalone fan store, a 220-room hotel, a separate 6,000-seater multi-use arena, a residential tower, a pavilion, and, the icing on the cake, a 525-space multi-storey car park and cycle hub. Exotic. However, with Leicester's planning permission set to expire by the end of 2027, and with absolutely nothing to suggest that construction will begin anytime soon, this master plan seems to be more of a pipe dream given the current circumstances. I'm getting sidetracked, but the point is, Leicester's applicable add-backs for the 3-season period ending in 2023 were only in the region of £85 million, leaving them at a definitive £129.4 million of loss. Critically and almost indefensibly above the permitted limit of £105 million. Rather predictably, therefore, the club was charged by the Premier League for being in breach of PSR rules. That was until Leicester submitted an appeal against said charge and unbelievably won. The decision was made that the Premier League were unable to prosecute the Foxes due to their relegation to the Championship, as they were technically outside of their jurisdiction. This loophole would be quickly closed by the Premier League, but not before Leicester had escaped without punishment. Although in this Curly-Wurly-esque saga, there is another twist to the tale, and it may well be the Premier League who instead get the last laugh. As outlined in an article by the man with the greatest name in journalism, and someone who appears to be informally inviting me to steal his toilet, the Foxes have been charged once more by the Premier League for PSR breaches. Having incurred a loss of £19.4 million for the 23-24 season, the applicable 3-year period still includes those previous monstrous losses, which, when adjusted for add-backs, is still almost certainly above the PSR maximum loss threshold. Especially when you consider the fact that this maximum loss limit of £105 million reduces by £22 million for every season spent outside of the Premier League. So while there's been no official statement as of yet, the result is all but confirmed, and thus a points deduction for this current season in the Championship seems inevitable. Leicester City were relegated directly back to the Championship in the 24-25 season, and a notable factor behind the Foxes underperforming has to be the managerial instability. Since winning the English Second Division at the first time of asking, Leicester's manager Enzo Maresca would almost immediately jump ship to join fallen giant Chelsea. The Bowley bankrolled Blues have a familiar history with signing players from the Foxes, and that window, it would be a fan favourite and local lad Kiernan Dewsbury Hall who made the switch to Stamford Bridge for €35 million. Steve Cooper would be appointed roughly 2 weeks after Maresca's departure. Despite Cooper's side being 16th, albeit only a point clear of the drop zone, he would be dismissed on the 24th of November 2024 to make way for the arrival of recent Manchester United interim manager Ruud van Nistelrooy. While Steve Cooper was almost destined to fail given his recent successful stint at rivals Nottingham Forest, and thus never really gained the fans' support, his side's record of 10 points from 12 games, 2 wins and 4 draws, was irrefutably better than that of his successor Van Nistelrooy. The ex-Man United striker would fail to strike a tune from his players and would instead strike out with 15 points from 26 games, 4 wins and 3 draws in over double the number of fixtures. The Dutchman had been given a rude awakening, and by the 27th of June 2025, his P45. His replacement would be 43-year-old Spaniard Martí Cifuentes. He was formerly the manager at Scandinavian trio Sandefjord, Aalborg and then Hammarby of Norway, Denmark and Sweden respectively, before most recently taking charge of Queen's Park Rangers in the Championship. Cifuentes had arrived at Loftus Road with the challenge of saving the Hoops from relegation, sat second bottom and with the worst goal difference in the league after 14 games. The Spaniard would prove to be an inspired appointment, securing safety with a 4-0 win over Leeds, which would incidentally be the result that sealed Leicester's automatic promotion under Maresca, and reaching 18th by season's end. He would follow that up with a 15th place finish the following season, garnering interest from initially West Brom and then the relegated Leicester City. Proven at this level, Cifuentes would willingly offer to take a pay cut to cover half of the $500k compensation due to QPR. And this brings us to the present, where at the time of writing Leicester sit 12th and due to be heard in court over their PSR breach. Whilst the managerial uncertainty had certainly played its part, having had 6 different managers plus 2 interim coaches over the 2.5-year period before this season, there comes a time when other factors should be brought into question. Perhaps the most critical of these factors is the recruitment philosophy of the club, so let's break it down. Leicester's rise was heavily facilitated by a simple transfer strategy, buying players for relatively cheap who fit the club's mentality, and then occasionally selling a star player for big money in order to balance the books. We've established that the books have been far from balanced since COVID, but what exactly caused this? Was there a sudden shift away from the latter, leading to distinctly reduced transfer revenue? Well, no, not exactly. Instead, it seems the actual change was a slightly more glacial one, and it was instead at the expense of the former. You see, prior to the shock title win of 2015-16, the Foxes would rarely sign more than 1 or 2 players for fees higher than 6 figures, albeit with 2 notable exceptions. The most obvious being the year before winning the Premier League, when Leicester had experienced top division prize money and broadcasting revenue for the first time since 2004. The other exception being the turn of the century, when Leicester spent heavily and was still relegated. King Power would gain ownership of Leicester in 2010, and initially, that astute transfer strategy I mentioned earlier would come into play. Notable names who would greatly contribute to Leicester's title whilst costing less than £2 million each were Kasper Schmeichel, Wes Morgan, Danny Drinkwater, Richie Delap, Matty James, Paul Konchesky, Riyad Mahrez, plus Mark Brighton, Esteban Cambiasso and Christian Fuchs, who were free transfers. And of course, the legendary Jamie Vardy, who cost £1 million from Fleetwood Town in the summer of 2012. The larger transfer sums would burst onto the scene in 2014-15, which coincided with both Leicester's return to the Premier League, but also with the appointment of John Rudkin as the club's sporting director. For the most part, the increased price tags were warranted, as both Leonardo Ulloa and Shinji Okazaki would both cost 8 figures, but would also play pivotal roles in the 5,000-to-1 season. The same could be said for N'Golo Kante, who cost €9 million from SM Khan, and was undoubtedly worth every penny. The tide would visibly shift after the miraculous Premier League title win under Claudio Ranieri, and suddenly €31 million had been spent on 28-year-old Islam Slimani from Sporting Lisbon. And it wouldn't end there. €92 million were spent on transfers in the 2016-17 season, which was still a net spend of €26 million, despite the big money departures of Kante, Andrej Kramaric, and academy product Jeffrey Schlupp. All it had taken was one massive overperformance, and it appeared as though the big club mentality had taken over at Leicester City, at least initially anyway. 8-figure transfer fees weren't an issue on their own. After all, it's a sign of the rise of the Premier League. Instead, it was the frivolous nature with which those fees were being paid. Islam Slimani would be statistically equally as prolific as both Ulloa and Okazaki across their Leicester careers, whilst costing almost 3 times as much money. Meanwhile, that same season, Ahmed Musa would join from CSKA Moscow for just shy of €20 million, only to be loaned back the following season and then sold to Al Nassr for €16.5 million at a time when the Saudi Pro League was largely irrelevant relative to the present day. Moreover, €5 million was spent on Polish attacking midfielder Bartosz Kapustka, who would only ever make 3 first-team appearances before leaving on a free transfer. Roman Abramovich had been so pleased with the €35.8 million signing of N'Golo Kante that the Russian oligarch would spend even more money on acquiring the services of Danny Drinkwater for his Chelsea team. €37.9 million to be exact. Although, given how Drinkwater's career fell off like a Kremlin critic from a building, I'd question what services Danny had provided, if any at all. This would become indicative of the new policy that Leicester's recruitment team had adopted. In order to facilitate the increased transfer spend, the Foxes would be required to sell a star player in each season in order to balance the books. The club would still suffer net losses in the transfer market, though. Losses to the tune of €33.7 million, €18.8 million, and €15.8 million across the 17-18, 18-19, and 19-20 seasons, respectively. Whilst not a problem regarding PSR, which had been introduced in its current iteration back in 2015-16, they were still losses that, with the benefit of hindsight, were due to increasingly poor recruitment decisions. In 2017, Adrian Silva would join the Foxes for €20.5 million from Sporting Lisbon, only to be loaned to Monaco, where he would make double the appearances he would ever make in Leicester Blue, and then leave on a free 2 seasons later. Likewise, in 2018, Filip Benkovic would make the switch from Croatian giants Dinamo Zagreb for €14.5 million, and would proceed to make a grand total of 2 first-team appearances for Leicester. Instead, it was 4 different loans and then a free transfer for the centre-back. Loans would become a common theme, as in the same window the Foxes would fork out another €14 million for Algerian winger Rachid Ghazal, who had joined Monaco on a free the year prior. 2 full season loans later, and he would depart for a measly €3 million fee to Besiktas, where he had spent the previous season on loan. And how could I forget the other €14 million signing in 2018, the arrival of Danny Ward from Liverpool? The 2019-20 season was a familiar story. Yuri Tielemans, €45 million from Monaco, Jose Perez, €33.4 million from Newcastle, and $19.2 million to Sampdoria for the signature of Dennis Pratt. All 3 would have decent spells with the Foxes, making at least a century of appearances each. However, the real issue is how all 3 would depart on free transfers, with the first 2 still being in their prime years. On a side note, I'll always struggle to blame Dennis Pratt, as his Leicester career was often marred by hamstring issues, as well as severe underutilisation due to having to play second fiddle to James Maddison in terms of preferred position. Either way, these large transfer expenses would be recovered somewhat by the gargantuan €87 million fee received from Manchester United for Harry Maguire. Leicester would roughly break even the following season, almost entirely thanks to the €50 million sale of youth academy product Ben Chilwell to Chelsea. However, the 2021-22 season would see the arrivals of Patson Daka, Boubakary Soumare, and Yannick Vestergaard for a combined €67.6 million, along with the free transfer of a 32-year-old Ryan Bertrand on eye-watering wages relative to his squad status. Bertrand would only appear on 11 occasions for the Foxes, whilst instead missing a total of 77 games across 553 days, sidelined with a knee injury. Meanwhile, the other arrivals I mentioned are still at the club, and strong arguments could be made for their lack of quality and contributions having led to Leicester's current predicament. Daka has been a 1 in 7 striker for Leicester in the league since his arrival, and hasn't scored in his last 38 games, leaving him 3 fixtures away from a goalless year. Soumare has never been a nailed-on starter at the King Power, being regularly behind Harry Winks, Wilfred Ndidi, and Oliver Skipp on the team sheet. And Yannick Vestergaard can shift in about the same way that a tectonic plate does. When it comes to signing sentient lampposts, Rudkin's recruitment team clearly thought the first time was so nice, they had to do it twice. Enter Harry Souttar, 2 metres of Scottish-born Australian centre-half. For €17 million, he was roughly 6 years Vestergaard's junior, yet somehow thankfully not his replacement as of yet, having been sidelined for over a year with an Achilles tendon tear. Other notable arrivals of the 2022-23 windows were the thoroughly whelming Wout Faes and the perfectly cromulent Victor Christiansen for €17 and €14 million respectively. Perhaps now it's beginning to make sense how the Foxes underperformed so dramatically that they were relegated. By this stage, Leicester had been hemorrhaging money as previously outlined, and the transfer of Wesley Fofana to, you guessed it, Chelsea, for €80 million simply wasn't enough to keep their losses in check. Without Premier League status, the Foxes would face a mass exodus as players attempted to avoid the sinking ship and the reputational damage that it could bring. On the other hand, there were possibly the only silver lining of this situation. The club could now directly offer first-team opportunities to their youth prospect. So would they take advantage of this? Short answer, no. The long answer, not really, no. Arguably, the sole beneficiary of this situation would be 22-year-old Seagrave graduate Casey McAteer, who would net 6 times across 23 games for his boyhood club. Elsewhere, opportunities were incredibly sparse, which Enzo Maresca is to blame for, although he would lead Leicester to the second division title, so who am I to question the methods of Team Pep Guardiola? As had become tradition, the recruitment team couldn't restrain themselves. and spent a total of €91 million, despite only recouping half of that through the sales of Kinning's Hall to Chelsea, and Tom Cannon's to Sheffield United. Of the incomings, Oliver Skipp had cost £20 million plus add-ons. Michael Golding joined for £5 million, just to end up straight in our under-21s, and Bilal El-Khanous would leave at the end of the season on loan to Stuttgart, with a buy clause totalling €18 million. He had cost us €22.5 million. Truly flawless business. Relegated once again last season, the Foxes have been granted a rare opportunity to re-evaluate their approach based off of recent failures. After all, how can you sell promising talents to Chelsea if you never put them in the metaphorical shop window? Plus, how do you repair substantial financial damage if your net transfer spend is north of £40 million, while your PSR loss limit just decreased to £83 million in the same 3-year period? The whole PSR palaver is another discussion for potentially another day, but what I will say is, way to go keeping the rich clubs rich and putting promoted clubs in an overspend or die ultimatum. Anyway, this summer's transfer window, while disappointing from a supporter's perspective, has established a critical step towards recovery for the Midlands outfit. Predictably, having lost plenty of quality and collecting €57.3 million in fees so far, that money has not been immediately re-injected twofold to sign replacements, whether that be with large upfront fees or through massive contracts for aging free agents. Instead, they would dip into the loan market to acquire some necessary quality, seemingly taking inspiration from awesome YouTube duo Zealand and Zealandism. If you're unaware of either of those guys, I urge you to check them out, as Zealand especially is a great fellow. Plus, he almost certainly won't see this, but you were my target on Strava, so I'd greatly appreciate that. Once again, I have become sidetracked. The most important difference for Leicester has been an enormous increase in dependency and belief in youth prospects. Maybe there's a fortuitous element, given that 16-year-old Jeremy Monger and 17-year-old Lewis Page weren't in the picture for first-team football 2 years ago. However, there are also older youth academy graduates who have benefited from these opportunities, such as 21-year-olds Ben Nelson and Silko Thomas. And then, of course, there's Leicester's first-choice goalkeeper, Poland youth international Jakub Stolarczyk. Born in Kielce, Stolarczyk had been playing senior football from the age of 15 at 7th-tier Piast Henscheny before joining the Leicester Academy in 2017. Now, the Polish shot-stopper will turn 25 in a month, having so far starred since Mads Hermansen's £18 million move to West Ham in the summer. To have ready-made replacements for outgoing players is the ideal scenario, especially when the replacement requires no transfer fee, no familiarisation period, and often lower wage commitments. That is the benefit of a high-quality youth academy, along with state-of-the-art training facility to assist in the development of young talent. The LCFC training ground in Seagrave cost approximately £100 million, which is, in my preferred unit of measurement, nearly 2 threads, and has been in operation since the latter months of 2020. The world-class facility boasts 14 full-size pitches, including an artificial pitch within the centrepiece air-conditioned dome and a show pitch with a 499-seat capacity. At that point, someone just needs to set up a camping chair or something. The Seagrave site is also home to the Sports Turf Academy, the first of its kind, which aims to train and educate future generations of elite groundskeepers. Now, I know that sounds niche and largely irrelevant, but it's good to have a contingency plan for if your head groundskeeper, someone renowned for some of the most intricate and beautiful designs in English football, gets poached by all-state-owned Manchester City. That's foresight. Anyway, the upshot is there is hope for Leicester City. Despite their recent struggles on the pitch, they are well equipped with infrastructure that can drive them forwards on the proviso that there are competent staff at the helm. As things stand, Martí Cifuentes hasn't quite hit the ground running in the Midlands, but with an already diminished squad and a recent injury crisis that has reduced a previously 23-strong list of fit senior players to just 18, this can arguably be forgiven. Unfortunately, Jakub Stolarczyk, Ben Nelson are among those hurt, along with defensive pair Caleb Okoli and Victor Christensen, and Bernie Loney, Aaron Ramsey. Meanwhile, there have been crucial alterations already involving not only the higher club staff, but also the hierarchy at King Power International Group. Reports suggest John Rudkin, the current director of football, is set to gain assistance with the appointment of Fox's first ever technical director. Plus, Leicester are also recruiting a new chief executive to replace Susan Whelan, as well as a new commercial director, with Kamondit Netanomsak having been brought in as interim managing director to support Kantop with this process. And the CEO made his commitment clear when he told media he's willing to pay compensation should the ideal candidate already be in work elsewhere. Furthermore, Kantop reportedly plans to adjust his UK visa to allow him to be more involved in the club's management by spending more time in Leicester. This was supplemented by the appointment of former AOT president Nitinai Sirismatakan as CEO of King Power International, with Kun Top assuming the role of Group Executive Chairman. Overall, this highlights a restructuring effort which aims to revive not just Leicester City Football Club, but King Power International Group as a whole, with the travel retailer having been described by its new CEO as like a patient surviving on oxygen. It is a process which may not reap immediate success on the football pitch, but instead hopes to rebuild for the future and to return the Foxes to the highs of those European nights almost a decade ago. Will it succeed? Only time will tell.